Imagine a single stretch of water, barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, that holds the entire global economy hostage. Every single morning, somewhere between 15 and 20 enormous oil tankers sail through this strip of sea. They carry roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply. 1/5 of everything that keeps your car running, your home heated, and your economy alive, all squeezed through this one tiny gap. And for decades, the world's most powerful nations have been locked in a silent, terrifying game of chess over who controls it. This is the Strait of Hormuz, and today, we're going to find out exactly why it matters, and what would happen if it ever closed. Let's start with the basics. Where exactly is this place, and what makes it so strategically important? The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, which then opens into the wider Arabian Sea and eventually the Indian Ocean. To the north sits Iran. To the south sit the United Arab Emirates and the small peninsula of Oman known as the Musandam Peninsula. Look at a map and you immediately understand the problem. The Persian Gulf is essentially a giant inland sea, one of the richest reservoirs of oil and natural gas on Earth. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, virtually every major Gulf oil producer sits inside this enclosed body of water. And there is exactly one way to get their oil out to the world. The Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest. It's just 21 miles wide. But here's the thing that really makes maritime experts nervous. The actual shipping lanes are even narrower than that. Due to shallow waters and international maritime rules, ships traveling in each direction are confined to lanes just 2 miles wide, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. So you've got supertankers, some of them over 300 meters long, fully loaded with 2 million barrels of crude oil, navigating a corridor barely wider than a small town. The depth is also a concern. While parts of the strait reach depths of 80 to 100 meters, many areas are considerably shallower. Fully laden supertankers can draw 20 meters of water beneath their hull, leaving uncomfortably tight margins in some sections. Navigation here is not for the faint-hearted, and the traffic is staggering. On average, roughly 17 to 21 million barrels of oil pass through the strait every single day. That's not a typo, every single day. To put that in perspective, that represents approximately 20 to 21% of global petroleum liquids consumption. Some estimates put it even higher when you include liquefied natural gas. Qatar, for instance, is the world's largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, and essentially all of it travels through Hormuz. Kuwait exports virtually all of its oil through Hormuz. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, all utterly dependent on this single choke point. When military analysts and geopolitical strategists talk about choke points, they're referring to places where geography creates vulnerability. Places where a small number of actors can exert disproportionate leverage over the flow of resources, trade, or people. By any measure, the Strait of Hormuz is the most consequential choke point on Earth. The strategic importance of this waterway isn't new, but its modern significance really crystallized in the 20th century as the world became hopelessly addicted to oil. For centuries, the Persian Gulf was a relatively quiet backwater of global trade, important for pearl fishing and regional commerce, but not the fulcrum of the world economy. That changed dramatically when oil was discovered in the region in the early 1900s. By the mid-20th century, the Gulf states were producing an enormous and growing share of global oil, and the Strait of Hormuz had become one of the most watched waterways on the planet. The Cold War brought superpower competition to the region. The United States and the Soviet Union both recognized that whoever influenced the Gulf controlled a critical lever of the global economy. The US established deep ties with Saudi Arabia, the Shah's Iran, and other Gulf monarchies. The Soviets pushed southward through Iraq and Yemen. Then came 1979, a year that fundamentally changed everything about this region. The Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah and replaced him with Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic Republic. Suddenly, a country that sat on one side of the strait and controlled 40% of its northern coastline had become a sworn enemy of the United States and most of the Western world. 1 year later, Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 brutal years, from 1980 to 1988, and during what became known as the Tanker War phase, roughly 1984 to 1988, both sides began attacking oil tankers in the Gulf, each trying to strangle the other's oil revenues. Hundreds of commercial vessels were struck, insurance rates skyrocketed. The global shipping industry held its breath. The United States responded by reflagging Kuwaiti tankers under the American flag and sending the U.S. Navy to escort them through the Gulf. In 1988, a U.S. warship, the USS Vincennes, shot down an Iranian civilian airliner, Iran Air Flight 655, killing all 290 people on board. The U.S. claimed it was a tragic case of mistaken identity. Iran called it deliberate murder. The wound has never fully healed. The tanker war ended with the Iran-Iraq ceasefire in 1988, but it had demonstrated with horrible clarity just how vulnerable global oil supplies were, and how willing regional powers were to weaponize that vulnerability. Then came the Gulf War of 1991, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and a US-led coalition responded. Again, the Strait was front and center of global strategic thinking. Again, the world watched nervously. Through the 1990s and 2000s, tensions ebbed and flowed. But Iran's nuclear program, Western sanctions, and repeated standoffs kept the Strait in the headlines. Iranian officials periodically threatened to close it if the US or Israel attacked their nuclear facilities. US officials responded that any attempt to close the strait would be treated as an act of war. This became the rhythm of the region: threat, counter-threat, crisis, de-escalation, repeat. Iran is, without question, the central player in any conversation about the Strait of Hormuz. And understanding Iran's strategic position requires understanding one crucial fact: Iran is simultaneously the country with the most to lose if the strait closes, and the country with the most capacity to close it. Let that sink in for a moment. Iran exports its own oil through the strait. Closing it would devastate Iran's economy too. And yet Iran's military doctrine has repeatedly pointed to the strait as its ultimate trump card against Western pressure. Why? Because Iran is in a fundamentally asymmetric military position. It cannot match the United States in conventional military power. It doesn't have aircraft carriers, fifth-generation stealth fighters, or a global network of bases. What it does have is a geography that gives it enormous leverage and a military doctrine built around exploiting that geography. Iran controls nearly the entire northern shore of the strait. From positions in this territory, Iran has deployed a layered defensive and offensive system that would make any attempt to force the strait enormously costly. The Revolutionary Guard's naval forces, the IRGC Navy, operate swarms of small, fast attack boats that can overwhelm conventional warships through sheer numbers. These aren't glamorous. They're essentially speedboats armed with rockets, missiles, and torpedoes. But dozens or hundreds of them attacking simultaneously in confined, shallow waters create a nightmare scenario for even the most advanced naval forces. Iran has also invested heavily in anti-ship missiles. The Noor, the Qatar, the Khalij Fars, these are sophisticated cruise and ballistic missiles capable of hitting large ships from considerable distances. Some of them can be fired from mobile launchers, making them very hard to neutralize preemptively. Add to this Iran's mining capabilities, the Persian Gulf is relatively shallow, and Iran has a significant stockpile of naval mines, both old-fashioned contact mines and more sophisticated pressure-triggered variants. Mining the strait wouldn't sink every ship, but it would force a complete halt to commercial traffic while the mines were swept. That process could take weeks or months. Iran has also developed extensive drone capabilities in recent years, adding yet another layer to its anti-access strategy. Could the United States and its allies eventually force the Strait open? Almost certainly yes. The US Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, exists largely for this purpose. American military superiority would eventually prevail, but eventually is the key word. In the days or weeks it might take, the disruption to global oil markets would be catastrophic. Oil markets are extraordinarily sensitive to supply disruptions. During the 2019 attacks on Saudi Aramco facilities, which briefly knocked out 5% of global supply, oil prices spiked by 15% in a single day. A Strait closure would be incomparably worse. Some analysts estimate prices could reach $200 or even $300 per barrel within days. The economic shockwaves would be felt in every country on Earth. And Iran knows this. The Strait isn't just a geographic feature, it's a weapon. And Iran has spent decades making sure everyone understands that. The strategic tension over Hormuz isn't just theoretical. In recent years, the Strait has been the scene of genuinely alarming incidents that have brought the world uncomfortably close to a much larger conflict. The period from 2019 to the present has been particularly intense. In May 2019, four commercial tankers, including two Saudi ones, were sabotaged near the port of Fujairah, just outside the Strait. Limpet mines attached to the hulls blew holes in the ships. Nobody was killed, but the message was clear. Someone was willing to attack commercial shipping. A month later, two more tankers were attacked in the Gulf of Oman, this time with even more dramatic results, leaving one ship on fire. The US blamed Iran. Iran denied it. Video footage released by the US military appeared to show an Iranian boat removing an unexploded mine from one of the stricken tankers. Then in July 2019, Iran seized a British-flagged tanker, the Stena Impero, claiming it had violated maritime regulations. Britain scrambled to respond. The ship was held for 2 months before being released. The incident illustrated just how easily a commercial vessel can become a political hostage in these waters. Iran has also demonstrated its willingness to target vessels linked to Israel. As the conflict between Iran and Israel has intensified, fought largely through proxies and covert operations, Israeli-linked tankers have been attacked multiple times. In 2021, a drone strike on the Mercer Street tanker killed two crew members. Iran denied responsibility, but the pattern of attacks was unmistakable. The Abraham Accords of 2020, in which the UAE, Bahrain, and other Arab states normalized relations with Israel, shifted the regional dynamic in important ways. Suddenly, countries right on the shores of the Strait were in open partnership with Israel, a development Iran viewed as encirclement and provocation. Meanwhile, Iran's nuclear program has continued to advance. As diplomatic talks have stalled, Iran has enriched uranium to levels close to weapons grade. The possibility of Israeli or American military strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities and Iran's likely response through the Strait remains a live concern. Every one of these incidents sends a shockwave through insurance markets, oil futures, and the offices of energy ministers around the world. The Strait of Hormuz doesn't need to actually close to cause damage. The mere threat of closure, the mere increase in risk, is enough to raise costs and rattle markets. Given how much geopolitical risk runs through the Strait, you might reasonably ask, why hasn't the world found a way around it? Why not just build pipelines that bypass the whole thing? The answer is, some have, but not nearly enough. Saudi Arabia operates the East-West Pipeline, also known as the Petrolini, which runs from its eastern province all the way to the Red Sea port of Yandu. At full capacity, it can carry around 5 million barrels per day. That sounds impressive until you remember that 17 to 21 million barrels per day flow through the Strait. The pipeline handles maybe 25 to 30% of what Hormuz moves. The UAE has its own pipeline, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, running from Abu Dhabi to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, bypassing the Strait entirely. Full capacity is around 1.5 million barrels per day. Iraq has some pipeline capacity running northward through Turkey to the port of Ceyhan on the Mediterranean. But this line runs through unstable territory and has frequently been disrupted by conflict or sabotage. The bottom line, even running all bypass infrastructure at full capacity, the world can reroute perhaps 4 to 5 million barrels per day away from the Strait. That leaves 12 to 16 million barrels per day with absolutely no alternative route. There is no plan B for most of what flows through Hormuz. Let's be concrete about what an actual closure would mean, not just for the countries involved, but for you. The immediate effect would be felt at the petrol pump. With 20% of global oil supply suddenly cut off, prices would surge within hours. Based on historical correlations, a sustained closure could push crude oil prices above $150 or even $200 per barrel. Petrol prices in the UK, Europe, and the US could double or triple within weeks. The ripple effects would go far beyond fuel costs. Oil is embedded in virtually everything: food production, plastics, pharmaceuticals, transport, electricity generation. A major oil price spike triggers inflation across the entire economy. It pushes up the cost of shipping goods, which raises prices in supermarkets. It raises energy bills, it squeezes business margins and kills jobs. Countries most exposed would be the major oil importers in Asia. Japan, South Korea, India, and China are all heavily dependent on Gulf oil. China alone imports around 40 to 50% of its oil from the Gulf region. A Hormuz closure would hit Asian economies with devastating force, potentially triggering recessions that would cascade through the global trading system. Strategically, a closure would also force consuming nations to draw down their strategic petroleum reserves. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve holds around 400 million barrels at pre-crisis consumption levels. That's roughly 20 days of total U.S. oil imports. It's a buffer, not a solution. The U.S. military would almost certainly intervene. The 1980 Carter Doctrine, articulated in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, explicitly committed the United States to using military force to defend free passage through the Persian Gulf. That doctrine has never been rescinded. The Fifth Fleet's primary mission is keeping the Strait open, but a military confrontation with Iran in the Strait would itself be deeply destabilizing. Even if the US prevailed relatively quickly, the political fallout, the potential for escalation into a wider regional war, and the disruption during the conflict itself would be severe. Everything we've talked about in this video, the threats, the scenarios, the warnings from analysts, stopped being theoretical on February 28, 2026. On that date, the United States and Israel launched coordinated military strikes on Iran in an operation that fundamentally changed the Middle East overnight. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who had led Iran for over 3 decades, was killed. Alongside him, a number of Iran's top military commanders were eliminated, including the IRGC commander, the defense minister, and the chief of staff. Iran's entire military leadership was, in effect, decapitated in a single night. Iran retaliated immediately, launching hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles at Israel, US bases, and allied countries across the region. Gulf states including the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain found themselves intercepting Iranian missiles on a daily basis. The region was at war, and the Strait of Hormuz it closed. An IRGC commander declared the strait closed and warned that any vessel attempting to pass through it would be set ablaze. Crude tanker transits through the strait dropped to just 4 vessels on March 1st, compared with an average of 24 per day, and 3 of those were Iranian-flagged. At least 5 tankers were damaged, 2 crew members killed, and around 150 ships left stranded around the strait. The economic shockwaves were immediate and severe. Brent crude surpassed $100 per barrel for the first time and for years, rising to a peak of $126 per barrel. The IEA described the situation as the greatest global energy security challenge in history. U.S. petrol prices spiked by over 50 cents per gallon within days. The IRGC declared it would not allow a single liter of oil through the strait, warning that vessels linked to the US, Israel, or their allies would be considered legitimate targets. Beyond oil, the ripple effects spread across the entire global economy. Fertilizer prices surged, with urea jumping from $475 to $680 per metric ton. Terrible timing given the spring planting season in the US Midwest. Major shipping companies including Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd suspended their Middle East routes entirely. QatarEnergy declared force majeure on all its export contracts, meaning Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter, simply stopped shipping gas. Europe, already running on historically low gas storage levels after a harsh winter, saw its benchmark gas prices nearly double within days. The world scrambled for responses. The IEA took the unprecedented step of releasing 400 million barrels of oil from global strategic reserves, but analysts pointed out that at 20 million barrels per day flowing through the strait normally, that only covers about 20 days of typical flows. It buys time, it doesn't solve the problem. Saudi Arabia diverted crude exports through the East-West pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, and the UAE rerouted oil via its pipeline to Fujairah. But as we covered earlier, these bypass routes can only handle a fraction of what normally flows through Hormuz. Goldman Sachs raised their US recession probability by 5 percentage points. Oxford Economics warned that if oil averaged $140 per barrel for 2 months, it would push the Eurozone, the UK, and Japan into economic contraction. Meanwhile, Iran installed a new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, Ali Khamenei's son, and the conflict showed no sign of ending quickly. This is not a hypothetical anymore. The scenario that experts have been warning about for decades, the one that kept energy ministers awake at night, that drove trillion-dollar military spending decisions, that shaped the entire geopolitics of the Gulf, is unfolding right now. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just the world's most important choke point. As of today, it is the world's most active crisis. The Strait of Hormuz is, in many ways, a perfect encapsulation of the world we live in, a world where geography still matters enormously, where the flow of energy is both the lifeblood of civilization and the source of its greatest conflicts. For decades, analysts warned that this day would come, that the endless cycle of threats, sanctions, proxy wars, and near misses would eventually tip over into something bigger. That the world's reckless dependence on 21 miles of contested water would one day come due. That day arrived on February 28, 2026. Right now, as you watch this video, hundreds of tankers sit idle. Oil prices are above $100 a barrel. Food prices are rising, businesses are absorbing shock after shock. And the world is asking a question it should have taken more seriously decades ago. What happens when the one thing holding the global economy together suddenly breaks? We don't have all the answers yet. The conflict is still unfolding. The ceasefire negotiations are fragile. The new Iranian leadership is untested. The US military is weighing its options. The outcome is genuinely uncertain, but one thing is absolutely clear. The Strait of Hormuz was always the most important 21 miles of water on Earth. We just didn't fully believe it until now. If this video gave you something to think about, please consider subscribing. Leave a comment below. Do you think the world will ever reduce its dependency on the Strait of Hormuz? Or is this a vulnerability we're stuck with for decades to come? I'd love to know what you think.